The sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of the Texas plains, turning the red earth to dust that swirled in lazy spirals with each gust of wind. Jake Morrison pulled his worn leather hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare as his horse, a sturdy paint named Thunder, picked its way carefully across the cracked ground. The drought had been going on for 3 months now, and the land showed every day of it in its parched, desperate face. Jake had been riding alone for the better part of 2 weeks, driving a small herd of cattle toward the railroad town of Sweetwater. It wasn't much of a herd, maybe 30 head, but it was all he had left after the bank took his ranch. Every dollar from this drive would have to count if he was going to start over somewhere else, maybe up in Colorado where a man could still make an honest living with cattle. The loneliness of the trail had settled into his bones like an old ache. At 32, Jake had spent more years alone than he cared to count, drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots. His weathered hands told the story of his life in rope burns and scars, and his gray eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much and said too little. It was late afternoon when Thunder's ears pricked forward, and the horse whinnied softly. Jake followed the animal's gaze and saw something that made him urge Thunder into a faster gait. There, about a quarter mile ahead, a lone figure knelt beside what looked like a massive bull. Even from this distance, Jake could see the animal was in distress, and the person trying to help was clearly struggling. As he drew closer, Jake realized the figure was a woman, and she was working frantically to free the bull's hind leg from what appeared to be a tangle of barbed wire. The animal, a magnificent longhorn with a spread of horns that had to measure 6 feet across, was lying on its side, exhausted and dehydrated. Foam flecked its muzzle, and its breathing was labored. The woman looked up as Jake approached, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. She was Cherokee, with high cheekbones and skin the color of burnished copper. Her long black hair was braided down her back, though strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dark eyes held a fierce intelligence and determination that spoke of someone accustomed to fighting for what she believed in. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, and her hands were cut and bleeding from working with the wire. "Easy there," Jake called out as he dismounted, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. Many folks in these parts didn't take kindly to Indians, and he wanted her to know he wasn't one of them. "Looks like you could use some help." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes taking in his weathered face, his honest demeanor, and the way he moved with careful respect around her and the injured animal. "He's been here for hours," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her people mixed with perfect English. "Maybe longer. The wire is cutting deeper every time he tries to move." Jake knelt beside her, examining the situation. The bull had somehow gotten tangled in old fencing wire, probably blown here by the constant wind. The more the animal had struggled, the tighter the wire had become. "We're going to need wire cutters," Jake said, reaching into his saddlebags. "And we'll have to work fast. This heat's killing him." "I'm Ayanna," the woman said as they began working together. "Ayanna Blackhorse." "Jake Morrison," he replied, carefully positioning the cutters. "On 3, I want you to pull that section of wire away from his leg while I cut." "Ready." Ayanna nodded, her hands steady despite the blood seeping from her cuts. Together, they worked methodically, cutting away strand after strand of the cruel wire. The bull, sensing their intention to help, remained remarkably still, though his breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. "There," Jake said as the last strand fell away. "Now we need water. This old boy's about done in." Ayanna was already moving toward a small canvas bag she had brought with her. "I have some, but not much. I was riding to the settlement when I found him." Jake looked around at the endless expanse of dry land. The nearest water he knew of was a small creek about 3 miles north, but he wasn't sure it hadn't dried up by now. "Thunder's got good legs," he said. "I can ride to Willow Creek and bring back water, but that'll take me the better part of 2 hours there and back." "He might not last that long," Ayanna said, kneeling beside the bull's head. She had torn strips from her petticoat and was gently cleaning the worst of the wire cuts on the animal's leg. "Look at his eyes. He's giving up." Jake studied the magnificent animal and saw she was right. The bull's eyes held that distant look that came just before death. But there was something else there too, a spark of fight that hadn't quite died out. "No," Jake said firmly. We didn't come this far to lose him now. He began stripping off his shirt, then soaked it with what little water they had. Help me get this over his head and neck. It won't be much, but it might help cool him down some. As they worked together, Jake found himself stealing glances at Ayanna. There was something about her that drew him. Not just her beauty, though she was surely the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but something deeper. The way she spoke to the bull in soft Cherokee words, the gentle strength in her hands, the determination that kept her working even as her own strength flagged. "Why?" he asked as they positioned the wet shirt over the animal's massive head. "Why risk yourself for a bull that doesn't belong to you?" Ayanna looked up at him, and for a moment, Jake felt as though she was looking straight into his soul. "My grandmother taught me that all life is sacred," she said simply. "This bull, you, me, we're all connected. When one suffers, we all suffer. When one is saved, we all are saved a little bit too." The simple profundity of her words hit Jake like a physical blow. In all his years of drifting, of keeping people at arm's length, he had never met anyone who saw the world the way Ayanna did. Most folks he knew looked out for themselves first and worried about others only if there was something in it for them. They worked in silence for a while, taking turns trickling the precious water into the bull's mouth and over his head. The sun continued its relentless assault, and Jake could feel his own strength beginning to ebb. Ayanna, he noticed, was swaying on her feet, though she continued to tend to the animal with steady hands. "You need to rest," Jake said. "Get in Thunder's shade and drink some water." "I'm fine," Ayanna replied, but her voice was weaker than before. Jake was about to argue when Thunder suddenly lifted his head and nickered softly. Following the horse's gaze, Jake saw a sight that made his heart leap with hope. A line of clouds was building on the western horizon, not the thin, wispy clouds that had been teasing them for weeks, but real clouds, heavy with the promise of rain. "Look," he said, pointing. Ayanna turned and saw the approaching clouds, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. It transformed her entire face, making her even more beautiful but also revealing a joy and hope that took Jake's breath away. The storm moved faster than either of them had expected. Within an hour, the sky had darkened and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The bull seemed to sense the change in the air and lifted his massive head slightly. Jake and Ayanna quickly repositioned themselves to catch as much of the precious rain as possible in their hats and any containers they could find. The rain started slowly, then picked up intensity until it was falling in sheets. Jake had never been so grateful for a storm in his life. They took turns holding their hats full of rainwater to the bull's mouth, and the great animal drank deeply, strength beginning to return to his eyes. But the effort had taken its toll on both of them. Ayanna, who had been working in the heat for hours before Jake arrived, suddenly swayed and collapsed. Jake caught her before she hit the ground, feeling how light she was, how much the ordeal had taken out of her. "Ayanna," he called, but she didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was hot to the touch despite the cooling rain. Jake realized she was suffering from heat exhaustion, possibly heat stroke. He had seen it before on cattle drives, and he knew how dangerous it could be. Working quickly, he carried her to a spot where Thunder's body would provide some shelter from the rain, then used his bedroll to create a makeshift shelter. He tore more strips from his own shirt and soaked them in the cool rainwater, then began applying them to her face and neck, trying to bring her body temperature down. The bull, meanwhile, was beginning to stir. The rain and water had restored enough of his strength that he was able to get his front legs under him. Jake kept one eye on the massive animal while tending to Ayanna, knowing that a bull of that size could easily kill them both if he felt threatened. But there was something almost human in the way the great animal looked at them. As Jake worked to help Ayanna, the bull slowly, carefully, maneuvered himself to a position where his bulk would provide additional shelter from the storm. It was as if he understood that the woman who had risked her life to save him was now in danger herself. For what felt like hours, Jake alternated between cooling Ayanna with wet cloths and checking her pulse. The storm raged around them, but their small shelter held, protected by Thunder on one side and the bull on the other. Jake found himself praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years, begging for Ayanna's life to be spared. As the storm began to subside, Ayanna's eyes fluttered open. "The bull," were her first words. "He's fine," Jake assured her, helping her sit up slowly. "Thanks to you." You saved his life. Ayanna looked around at their strange little tableau, Thunder standing guard, the bull resting nearby, Jake kneeling beside her with concern written across his features. We saved his life, she corrected softly. Over the next 2 days, as Ayanna recovered her strength and the bull healed from his injuries, Jake found himself falling deeper under the spell of this remarkable woman. She told him about her life, how she had been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a smallpox epidemic, how she had learned the old ways alongside the new, how she worked as a teacher in the Cherokee settlement but dreamed of seeing the world beyond the territories. Jake, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He told her about his failed ranch, about the years of drifting, about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Ayanna listened without judgment, her dark eyes full of understanding. You know, she said on the second evening as they sat by their small fire, watching the bull graze peacefully nearby, my grandmother used to say that sometimes the spirits send us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it, even if we don't recognize it at the time. Jake looked at her across the firelight, seeing not just her beauty but the strength and wisdom that seemed to shine from within her. And what do you think the spirits sent you? Ayanna smiled that transforming smile again. A lone cowboy with a good heart and gentle hands. A man who would risk everything to help a stranger save a suffering animal. And what did they send me? Jake asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. A reason to stop drifting, Ayanna said simply. The bull, whom they had taken to calling king because of his regal bearing, had recovered enough to travel. Jake made the difficult decision to abandon his small cattle drive and instead accompany Ayanna back to her settlement. He told himself it was because she might still be weak from her ordeal, but deep down he knew the real reason. For the first time in his adult life, he had found something, someone worth staying for. The Cherokee settlement was smaller than Jake had expected, maybe 40 families living in a mixture of traditional dwellings and newer frame houses. The people were wary of him at first, as he had expected, but Ayanna's endorsement and the story of King's rescue quickly won them over. Jake learned that King had belonged to a Cherokee rancher who had died the previous winter, leaving his livestock to fend for themselves. Most had been rounded up and sold, but King had escaped and had been living wild on the plains. The tribal council had been trying to catch him for months, but the wily bull had evaded all their efforts. He was waiting, said Joseph Blackhorse, Ayanna's uncle and one of the tribal elders. Waiting for the right people to find him. Animals know these things. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself becoming part of the community in ways he had never experienced before. He helped with the harvest, shared his knowledge of cattle and horses, and slowly began to learn some of the Cherokee language. The people accepted him not because of his skin color or his past, but because of his character and his devotion to Ayanna. King, meanwhile, had become something of a legend. The great bull had appointed himself guardian of the settlement's small herd, and his presence had already deterred 2 separate groups of rustlers. Children would bring him treats and sit in his shadow during the heat of the day, and he bore their attention with the patience of a grandfather. It was on a crisp October evening, as Jake and Ayanna sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, that he finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building in his heart for weeks. Ayanna, he said, taking her hand in his weathered one, I've been drifting all my life, never knowing what I was looking for. Now I know I was looking for you. For this. He gestured toward the settlement, toward the life they were building together. Will you marry me? Ayanna was quiet for so long that Jake began to fear he had misread the signals, that he had presumed too much. But then she squeezed his hand and turned to face him fully. My grandmother always told me that the right man would be brave enough to help a stranger, gentle enough to heal the wounded, and wise enough to know when he had found his home, she said. I've been waiting for you too, Jake Morrison. Yes, I'll marry you. They were wed according to Cherokee tradition on a day when the autumn leaves were at their most brilliant. King stood witness along with the rest of the settlement, his massive presence somehow making the ceremony feel blessed. Jake had never known such happiness was possible, had never imagined that life could hold such richness and meaning. Years later, when their children would ask about how their parents met, Ayanna would tell them the story of the day a lone cowboy and a Cherokee woman found each other while saving a bull in the desert plains. She would tell them about the importance of helping those who cannot help themselves, about the connections that bind all living things together, and about the way love can grow from the smallest acts of kindness. And Jake, listening to his wife tell their story, would think about that moment when he first saw her kneeling beside King, determined to save a life that others might have thought not worth saving. He had found his purpose that day, not just in loving Ayanna but in understanding that true bravery wasn't about facing down outlaws or breaking wild horses. True bravery was about opening your heart to another person, about choosing to care even when caring made you vulnerable. King lived to be 23 years old, ancient for a bull, and when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire settlement mourned. They buried him on a hill overlooking the plains where Jake and Ayanna had first found him, and they marked his grave with a stone that bore a simple inscription, "Here lies King, who taught us that all life is sacred." The settlement prospered over the years, growing into a small town that welcomed people of all backgrounds who were willing to work hard and treat others with respect. Jake and Ayanna raised 5 children there, each of whom grew up hearing the story of their parents meeting and learning the values that had brought them together. And sometimes, on hot summer days when the wind blew across the plains, the old-timers would swear they could see a great bull grazing peacefully on the hill, watching over the town that had grown up around the place where a lone cowboy and a Cherokee woman had once knelt together in the dust, united in their determination to save a life and, in doing so, save each other.